Okay, so Ethan and I developed this project just about 2 years ago, actually. Like Catherine said, we're both in the global health track, and so we wanted to get two different data sets and kind of merge them eventually, but as for now, we're keeping them separate. So I went to Kenya last November, and then Ethan will talk to you about his time in Guatemala. So this is the perceptions of depression and treatment modalities among rural Kenyan populations. Um, so the two of us also worked with Dr. Desai, who's the director of global health and primary care, and then with Dr. Cooley, who helped us more so with the specific psychiatric components. So we're just going to kind of run through a background on the mental health in Kenya and then run through the study, how we developed it, what all it entails, and then go through the data and then the classic discussion, barriers to treatment and limitations, and then future research. Just a quick quote from Dr. Rashid Aman, who's Kenya's Health Chief Administrative Secretary, said, "Health is wealth and there is no health without mental health." I just thought that's a nice quote to include. So some comparative health statistics, and the ones that really stand out to me are in blue that I kind of highlight throughout this presentation. I'm not going to read all of this to you. You can see the differences between Kenya and the US, but Kenya only spends 4.55% of their GDP on health expenditures, comparatively to the US, where we spend 17.36. Obviously, we still have a lot of health issues here, but if that tells you anything about how much Kenya could improve. And then the density of doctors was just pretty astounding to me. They don't even have one doctor per 10,000 people, where we have 36.1. Also, something to keep in mind is with the disability adjusted life years, it was relatively similar between Kenya and the United States, where depressive disorders were often in the top 3 out of the top 10. And they both were from ages 10 or 15 until 54, which made me think that the suicide deaths for Kenya probably is higher than 6.11. They're just not always reported, or autopsies aren't always done, which I'll talk about a little bit later as well. So these are just the leading causes of death in Kenya. And something to keep in mind is in the United States, drug-related deaths are actually number 7, and I would suspect that it would be higher in Kenya as well, which obviously can kind of go hand in hand with some depressive disorders, and I'll talk about that a little bit more soon. So 1 in 4 persons in Kenya seeking medical care have a mental health condition. And yet, as of 2015, Kenya had less than 100 psychiatrists. And as of 2021, Kenya did not have a specific budget dedicated to mental health. Some positives that I did note are in 2020, Kenya developed a mental health task force to implement mental health reforms, and the NACADA is actually a government agency that campaigns against alcohol and substance abuse and does receive national funding from the national budget. So this data is actually from the NACADA, where 1 in 20 Kenyans aged 15 to 65 were found to be addicted to alcohol in 2022, and 1 in 6 were using at least one drug or substance of abuse at the time. And like I said, these all contribute to 2 to 2.3 times higher risk of depressive disorders. So as for this study, our goals really were to identify the gap between the prevalence of depression and those receiving treatment, and then also to identify patient preferences and perceptions towards treatment modalities. And our hypothesis was that patients would be more likely to identify depression when physical symptoms are present, as you'll later see. And then we also thought that they would be more likely to self-identify as medically healthy, even if they did technically meet diagnostic criteria for depression via the PHQ-9 assessment. So these are just some questions that we wanted to answer. So again, just to see if patients are more likely to identify depression in somebody that has emotional or physical symptoms, if they see depression as a medical problem, can they identify depression in others, and what are the patient preferred treatment modalities? Those are the 4 that I really touch on in this presentation. I believe Ethan touches on questions 5 and 6 a little bit more in his. So this is just kind of the outline of our survey, which was 49 questions. So it begins with demographic questions like birth year, sex, marital status, and so on. Then we have a few questions about participants' personal experience with depression. Then they answer a full PHQ-9. Then there's one vignette with emotional symptoms, and the score of the person in the vignette would be 14 on the PHQ-9, and then another one that's roughly the same, just demonstrates physical symptoms, and again, a score of 14. And then we have the combined symptoms vignette with a PHQ-9 score of 27, and that goes into more detailed questions. All of the vignettes do ask if the person has a medical problem, if the person has depression, and if the person being surveyed has ever felt this way. So this is the PHQ-9, just in case anybody is not familiar with it. You can go back and look at this later. But just a little bit of background on the PHQ-9 is it was developed in 1999 to make criteria-based diagnoses. It is known to have internal reliability and test-retest reliability and has been translated and validated in more than 70 languages and dialects. One thing that Ethan and I wanted to be aware of was like the cultural significance. So one of the questions asks, do you have trouble concentrating on things such as reading the newspaper or watching television? And we thought it was important just to take this into consideration. Some of the people in these remote villages aren't watching television, so we wanted to make sure that it was applicable to everybody. Then the scoring is 0 to 4 would be minimal or no depression. And in this project, I kind of classified anybody that had a score of 5 or more as qualifying for mild depression. These are just more screenshots of the survey, so you can come back and look at them. So inclusion criteria was basically anybody that is 18 years or older and is able to answer survey questions. If the person spoke English, I kept the survey in English so they could fill it out on their own. If they did not, then we had translators that were just local people from the village that happened to speak good English. They could translate it into Swahili or Luo. And then all participation took place after care was received, and we did obtain verbal consent. So some of the demographic data, 26 participants were involved, 12 of them did utilize translators. It was a little skewed more towards females. We had 18, whereas we had 8 males. And those two are some of the demographic data that we kind of focused on more in this presentation. All 26 participants did have a Christian background of some sort. So you'll see that come into play a little bit as well. And then we had a pretty diverse group of workers. And then most of our participant population came from Gen Z. And then we had pretty equal millennial and Gen X, and then a few boomers in there. So 8 people had PHQ-9 scores of 4 or less, meaning they did not technically qualify for depression. So that'd be the minimal to no depression. Then 5 to 9, or sorry, above 5, I classified as mildly depressed. And so that was 18 of the participants. So this slide shows if they were able to recognize it in themselves. So the pie chart is just based on the PHQ-9 score. So that's where we have 42.3% classify as mild depression. 8 of those 11 people reported current or past depression. So that means 8 of those people were able to recognize that they had felt either depressed at some point in their life or currently. So in total, 50% of people were able to recognize their own feelings of depression, and 67% that actually met depression criteria were able to recognize it in themselves. This then looks at the same thing, but the people that were able to take the survey without translators, and then the people that did need to use translators. And it wasn't quite a significant p-value, but it was close, so I included it. So it was 0.07 in the difference of people that did admit to feeling depressed. So you'll see that is this blue over here, the difference between people that use a translator and the people that did not. So that's just showing that there might have been a little bit of false answers because those people were using translators. And that kind of leads to just us to infer that possibly it was the stigma that is associated, or just not feeling comfortable admitting, or since it's not technically significant, it could have been a coincidence. So then this one, oh, got cut off a little bit. But so this is based on the PHQ-9 score. So these people, which was a total of 18, met criteria for depression. Then this was the total of 8 that did not. This box, I did the people that met PHQ-9 criteria and also recognized it, which means like they answered this question number 2 that they either have been or are currently depressed. And this blue box is who sought treatment. So who went to see a psychiatrist, psychologist, or other person to treat them for a mental illness, which actually was more than I expected to see, but still not a very great amount. This, our p-value was seeing if there's a difference between males and females that were comfortable with sharing their feelings. So the question is, when you feel sad, do you feel comfortable sharing those emotions with a friend, family member, or someone else? And I kind of expected to see a difference in the males versus the females, but clearly with a p-value of 0.66, there was no difference in that. 14 of the 17 yeses did qualify as mildly depressed, so that's encouraging that they would be willing to share those feelings. Then, like I said before, we had 3 questions that were asked in every vignette, and that's this person has a medical problem, and they could say yes, no, unsure. This person is likely experiencing depression, again, yes, no, unsure, and I have felt this way. So vignette 1 is the one that showed the emotional symptoms. Vignette 2 showed the physical symptoms. Again, this p-value was close, so I included it at 0.05. Between the emotional symptoms, we had almost a significant p-value in them being able to recognize the physical symptoms over here as opposed to the emotional. Then between experiencing depression and feeling similar, they were pretty equal, so no significant data there, but it did confirm our hypothesis that people are far more likely to determine depression in somebody displaying physical symptoms. Then I just thought this would be interesting to see if the people that technically do meet depression criteria with a PHQ-9 score of 5 or greater, if they were able to recognize these differences better. So this was a significant p-value at 0.02, and that is again with them being able to determine the physical symptoms greater than the emotional symptoms. And then this is the same data just on vignette 3. The left one is in everybody, and the one on the right is in a PHQ-9 of 5+, and it's a pretty similar distribution. They were able to determine that it is in fact a medical problem, and like I said before, this person was displaying emotional and physical symptoms and also had a PHQ-9 score of 27. So we were hoping that they would be able to recognize that this person is in fact experiencing a medical problem, depression, and some of them did feel similar. I won't go into this, it's pretty detailed, but I just looked at all 3 vignettes, how much consistency there was, and so a lot more people than I expected were able to recognize depression in all 3 vignettes. That was 9 of them. Or sorry, a medical problem, not depression. Then 15 of them did recognize depression in all 3, and 9 people did say that they felt similarly to all 3 vignettes. So now going into the more specific results, aside from those 3 questions that we've already discussed, people's perceptions of depression. So 60% of people said that this person is weak-willed. And again, these are all based off of the 3rd vignette, which is both emotional and physical symptoms. And 64% said if this person stopped over-worrying, this problem would go away. And I looked to see if there was any difference in people that met depression criteria with that PHQ-9 score of 5 or greater, and there really was no difference. The yes answers, meaning yes, they're weak-willed or yes, they're over-worrying, came from people that did and did not qualify, so there was no difference there. Then people, as you can see, do not view depression or feeling this way as acceptable, but they do feel comfortable talking. So again, I just thought that that's an encouraging point because it shows that people would possibly be open to therapy, which we'll get to, and just comfortable talking to their friends and family. As far as religious involvement goes, I expected to see a little bit more people believing that there'd be a religious or spiritual explanation, but as you can see, far greater people said that there would not be. And there was a slight preference that it would improve with prayer, but nothing drastic there either. 32% of people did say the person in the vignette should seek help from a religious healer. This is a separate question from the two I've listed above. And 80% said that they should be in thought of a doctor. Participants were allowed to circle as many options as they felt applicable, though, so that's why these numbers don't quite add up to the 25. Or actually, and sorry, I should have explained sooner that there were 26 participants, but one person skipped all of vignette 3. So for all of this data, we have 25. Then perceptions of doctors, 92% of people said this person should see a doctor, which was a question of its own. 64% said they could be Kenyan or American, so there's no preference for nationality there. And 80% said that it could be the same or opposite sex. So again, no preference on sex. As far as perceptions of treatment go, people seem to be pretty open to American or Kenyan meds. Clearly, there's a lot of debate between them whether there's any significance of meds. And I think some of that is just because there's such a lack of access that they're unsure if these medications could actually help these issues, since there's, again, such a stigma surrounding it as well. And then plant-based remedies seem to have sort of differing results, and people weren't so sure that those would help. Perceptions of exercise, as you can see, 68% of people believe that they would benefit from exercising more. And like I said, we'd get to perceptions of therapy. So 68% of people said that they would likely benefit from going to weekly meetings to talk about how they feel. And it seems there's not a huge opinion on whether that needs to be individual or with a group, since we had 48% say individually, and then 24% say with a group that feels the same way. And some people thought that both options were equal. So this is pretty much just a review of everything I said. Like participants did recognize depression in themselves far more than we expected. More than double the amount of people admitted to having current or past depression than sought treatment. Participants were far more likely to recognize depression when physical symptoms were present as opposed to the emotional symptoms. As a whole, they did not feel that these feelings are acceptable, but they are willing to talk to family and friends about these feelings. Religion didn't play as large of a role as I expected, but some of them did believe that it would improve with prayer. Depression does warrant seeing a doctor. They believe in American and Kenyan medications, although they are unsure to a certain degree, and exercise and therapy may improve symptoms. Some limitations to this study is that it was conducted within a small window of time. We're there for about 10 days, so that's only a certain amount of people that we could reach. It also only included persons seeking medical care. Since if there were only 26 participants, it was a smaller sample size, and since the survey was 49 questions, it did take a bit of time. Other things I noted are that all of this data was from one village, although people did travel from pretty far areas. We still were reaching mainly people that could walk to the hospital that we were at. And the translators we used, like I said, they were just local people that are able to speak English. And so some of our translations might have been a little bit off, which could have impacted. Some barriers to treatment are the lack of access to providers and medication. Like I said, there were less than 100 psychiatrists in 2015, even though that number probably has climbed since then. That's still not enough to serve the people. especially since 1 in 4 experience depression. There's a lack of follow-up care from medical mission trips like we did, especially even though they go back a few times a year, that's still just not enough to see as many people that need to be seen and assessed. There's a lack of education. We did have quite a few people say that they had never heard of depression or weren't sure about various things throughout the study. There's public stigma, self stigma, and label avoidance, like I mentioned. And then we also just need to bridge the more readily available traditional or faith healers with the medical providers. As far as future research goes, I would like to repeat the study in other villages and cities within Kenya, including the larger cities like Nairobi, just to see how the data might change or skew different ways. We could research how to improve access to psychiatrists, medication, etc., which would hope that the um, government is working on, and repeat the study with an educational component and assess how responses differ, such as handing out a pamphlet that describes depression that includes both the emotional and physical symptoms. And these are my sources.